Hey guys, welcome to the video, welcome to my garage. In this video, I'm going to go over what bump steer is and why it happens. Alright, so here we are down in the RC playground. So let me first I'm going to grab the Monster Beetle, then the Hot Shot, then the vintage RC10. These will all have slightly different amounts of bump steer, and then I think it'll be a good representation. Let's take a look at the Monster Beetle first. So if we take the Monster Beetle here, and if you look, when I push down on the suspension, you see how when I get towards the bottom, the wheels turn in, they cut in. Both of them do that. And so when the suspension is down, it's got a severe toe in. As a matter of fact, when this vehicle is totally neutral, it's actually a little bit towed out to try to compensate for some of that. But when it's fully compressed, they toe in. And that's because the geometry is incorrect on this vehicle. Obviously, this is just a little toy radio-controlled car, and so they didn't put a lot of effort into getting proper geometry. Let me take the body off and see if we can show a little bit better why it's so bad. So if you take a look at this car, this is actually a horrible suspension setup. Don't get me wrong, I really like the RC car. I had one of these when I was a kid, and I had just an insane amount of fun with this, but the actual design is terrible. This screw right here is a pivot point, and then this screw right here is the other pivot point. So the suspension arms are actually really, really short, and you can see when the suspension moves here. Okay, so that's the geometry. It's got this arm, and then below it is the other arm. Those are what are allowing the tires to move. But if you look, these two pivot points right there, yet the steering arm, the outboard pivot point, is way over here. You can see from that pivot point to that is really long. And then on the other side, from here, where it actually connects to the servo, or in a real vehicle it would be the steering rack, is even further outside there. So these 2 points are so short compared to how long these points are, that when the suspension goes in its arc, because if you remember, when the suspension goes, these form an arc as it goes around. So as this suspension goes up and down, it's not just going up and down, it's actually, to exaggerate it, it's going like this because it's traveling on an arc. And so its distance changes as it swings in and out. And when that distance changes, if it's not geometrically in line with the steering link, which it isn't, because this link is much longer than these short little arms, so the geometry for the steering arm is traveling on a different path than the geometry for these arms. So as the suspension arms are going like this, making a large curve because they're short, the steering arm is longer, so it's making not as exaggerated of an arc. What that does is it means that as the suspension travels through its range, the distance of the steering arm changes. And that's why, as the suspension moves, you can see here the steering changes. And you can see they're both towing in as it goes down. And in a real vehicle, you can't, on a toy car like this, you don't even really notice it. But on a real car, if you were going through the whoops, or landing on a big jump, or really anytime the suspension is moving rather aggressively, you would feel that, most likely, you would feel that in the steering wheel. Alright, now we're looking at the Hot Shot here. The Hot Shot is interesting because if you remember, the Monster Beetle there, as the suspension compressed, it towed in. The Hot Shot here, as it compresses, it tows out. Yet they're both double wishbone suspension. The Hot Shot here, they put a lot more effort into trying to keep it geometrically correct. So we've got a pivot point right here, and then we've got a pivot point in here, and these are nice long arms. We like that. But the steering arm is right there, and it's pretty close to the pivot points on this side, so that's pretty good. On the inside here, the pivot points are a little bit inboard, not terrible, but they are a little bit inboard. So it's not moving on the same plane, but they put a lot more effort into keeping this one closer. But the difference is, if you look on the bottom there, you can see where the steering arms go into the chassis. It's really, really low. As a matter of fact, the connection point is lower than the lower control arm. And what that does is, as the suspension's traveling, once it gets towards the top here, because those steering links are so low, it's actually pulling it away from the steering arms. And as that happens, it pulls the steering spindle in, and that's what causes it to toe out. Really interesting. Really a shame, because aside from that, this is not a terrible suspension setup, but they've got those arms so darn low. So anyways, that is bump steer on the Hot Shot. Let's take a look at the RC10. Alright, so here we have an original vintage Team Associated RC10. And fun fact, this is actually my car. I bought this when I was probably around 14 years old. I've modified a lot of it, so a lot of it, probably most of it, is not original, but this body is the original body that I painted as a kid. So I've probably had this car for 35 years, so that's kind of cool. And I used to race this car when I was young. Anyways, this car is specifically meant for competition. So this car, they put a lot of effort into getting the geometry correct on the suspension. So if you notice, as this one goes through its motion, there's very little to zero bump steer. And if you look on their suspension, first of all, on the spindle side here, they have a pivot point here, there's a pivot point here, and directly in line is the pivot point for the steering. You can see all three of those are in the same plane. And then on the inboard side, they have a pivot point right here, and then the upper link pivot point right there. So it's basically going straight up. And then the steering pivot point is right there. So it is a little bit inboard, but not too much. I'll pull the body off. Actually, let me pull the body off and show you that. So you can see on this car, they actually put some serious effort into designing this little bell crank system so that they could get the pivot points as close to the pivot points of the suspension as possible. You wouldn't do this on just a cheap radio controlled car, but since this was meant for competition, they didn't want you to have really any bump steer. So when it goes through its motion, oh, and another thing worth noting is not only is the geometry correct, but they have the steering arm basically in the middle of the arms. And that makes it so that, kind of like the opposite effect of the Hot Shot, when it travels through its motion, the steering arm is traveling basically on the same arc that the control arms are, and as it goes through its travel, it's not walking up to or pulling away from the steering. So this is a really good design. So hopefully with that, you guys have a pretty good idea of what bump steer is. Now let's go back up to the garage and take a look at Ratchet, and I'll show you that, to be honest with you, I designed his a lot around this setup, but I'll show you how his geometry stays in line. So what I'm going to do for starters here is I'm just going to pick this up. I've got the spring out so that I can show you guys this. I'm going to pick it up to full compression, and then I'm going to set the camera up so that you guys are looking straight down on the steering here. And then I'll kick this bar out so we can watch it fall, and we'll see if the spindle moves at all, which would be bump steer. Spoiler alert, it shouldn't, because I designed it not to have bump steer. Let's find out. Oh, mama! Oh, this is heavy. It's heavier than you think. Oh. Okay. All right, let's get you set up on the tripod. Okay, I hope you guys can see this. This is the steering knuckle. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this bar out, and the suspension's going to drop. And this should stay nice and straight. Let's see. Yeah, I don't know. I'm pretty sure you guys didn't see anything. As I watched it go down, I don't think I saw any change whatsoever, which is good. So let's take a look at the geometry on that. All right, so let's see what I've got here. Similar to the RC10, I've got a pivot point here, and I've got a pivot point there. The steering arm runs pretty much in the middle of the control arms. It's a little bit high, but not too much. And then it's a little bit to the outside of these two pivot points. But if we come to the inside here, I've got a pivot point right here, pivot point right there. So these go a little bit on an angle there. It's very similar to the angle here. This lower and upper control arm are very close in length. If I remember correctly, I think the upper arm is a 1/2 inch shorter than the bottom, just to give it a minuscule amount of camber in when it's up at the top. But they're essentially almost completely parallel and almost the same length. And the steering arm is almost the same length as well. I think it's within like 1/4 of an inch. And because I'm on the outside over here, if you come here, you can see that my steering rack is a little bit to the outside as well. So this is a custom piece that I made here, and I made this specifically to push that steering arm out the same distance from here to here, which is, I don't know, whatever that is, like 1/2 an inch, 3/4 of an inch. It's the same distance as over here, so that essentially my lower control arm, my steering arm, and my upper arm are essentially the same length and essentially traveling in the same path. If I'm being dead nuts honest with you guys, I think the last time I actually measured it, I think there was like 1 degree of bump stop from full droop to full compression, and I can't even feel that on the trail. So in a nutshell, that's what bump steer is. Literally, like the definition says, it's when you're steering bumps going through this suspension travel. I hope I illustrated that fairly well on those RC models. Originally, I was thinking about a way to mock this up so that I could show you it just like this, and then I would somehow get a different pivot point for my steering arm so I could put the suspension through its travel, and it would then have some pretty severe bump steer. But I couldn't figure out a way to do that without making a completely custom steering arm for the very purpose of it just being a bad design. I just, call me lazy, I didn't want to go that far. So I'm really hoping that showing you the RC cars illustrated it. If you're designing a system and you're trying to make a car that's as high performance as you can possibly make it, you should put a lot of effort into designing it so that there's no or very, very minimal bump steer. if you've got a trail rig or something, you know, you want as little bump steer as possible, but if you have a little bit, it's not going to be the end of the world. So if you have a vehicle that has some bump steer, don't bum too hard about it. It's not, there's worse things in life. But regardless, that's it for this video, guys. I hope it illustrated pretty well what bump steer is, and I hope it possibly helps you with whatever project you might be working on, and I hope to see you on the next video. Take care.